Hello again, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. These webinars are always informative and always important because I don't know about you, but even being a nurse and being in this, I still learn something every time we do this. So I'm Bridgette Picou. I am with the Well Project, where we, of course, focus on women and girls living with and vulnerable to HIV. And I could not be here with a better panel of women, I don't think at all possible. We're going to start with Dr. Eileen Scully, who is going to give us a presentation, and then we will jump into Waheeda and Dawn afterwards. So I'll give them a quick introduction at that time. In the meantime, please make sure that you're muted. Thank you for being here and being attentive. Activate that call tree and those text messages while we're sitting here. If you know someone who you think should be here, who's not here, send them a message. And with that said, let's get started. Eileen,
let me just say that Dr. Scully is here from her vacation spot, all right, to be
absolutely
with us. She's one of my heroes from Hopkins, who's done very early work on women and HIV, and I think she's got some really interesting stuff to tell us. So take it away, Eileen.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. Let me get this up. Am I situated correctly? Or the screens look right?
No, we're seeing the presenter view.
Yeah, maybe do the swap displays thing.
Yeah. There we go.
There we go.
Thank Perfect. You. Thank you for not letting me forge ahead with all my notes out there. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's an honor to be here. I have a policy of always saying yes to any request from the community, because the community is the only reason why any of us do any of the work we do. And if what we're doing is not directly feeding back to what is needed, then we need to hear that and we need to change that. And I think the more times that you have the opportunity to speak with people who are engaged in these questions, the better your work will be for all of us who work in the space of caring for people with HIV or for doing research. I also am going to take one other brief detour, so Linda, don't kill me, but I noticed Rebecca Dennison on this call, and I just wanted to specifically call out to her because in December of 2016, I was giving a talk that was at a seminar organized by the Well Project, and Rebecca just in one moment said something about meeting people where they are as a principle of community work, but as directly applicable to how I was interacting with other scientists, that has just really changed how I think about talking to other scientists. And that bi-directional learning was it's something I carry with me all the time. I haven't seen her since that meeting, I don't think, but I just wanted to say a public thank you because that really impacted me in my work. Okay, great. So my task is to talk a little bit about the science related to long-term survivors and HIV cure research, specifically as relevant to women, 50 plus women living with HIV. And my email is there, but please feel free to put things in the chat. I will try to keep up with things as we go. So here's a preview slide. So the key question, what are specific features of women living with HIV that are relevant for cure? Key findings are that sex hormones and sex chromosomes may impact curative interventions. And why is this important? Because interventions may need to be tailored to a specific sex or gender, and we'll sort of unpack how those could be different. And then how is this related to cure? So hormones and other immune characteristics may impact responses to cure interventions. And then the last part, which I think is one of the most important things, is should we be excited about this? And to this, I will just say that if the community is not excited, no one will be. And 50% of the population will remain understudied. And so I really hope that you're excited about this, because I think it is not one of those things that comes immediately to mind for a lot of scientists, but it is absolutely critical if we're going to keep moving things forward for everybody living with HIV. So a quick outline. I'll talk briefly about representation of women in clinical studies, just because I think it's important to baseline set for understandings about that, some specific considerations for women in cure and HIV pathogenesis, and then just a few comments at the end about thinking about the lifespan and when and why would a cure be a good idea across the lifespan of a woman. So setting the stage. So inclusion of women in clinical trials. So in 1977, the FDA recommended excluding women of childbearing potential. So regardless of your intentions, if you had the potential, from phase 1 and early phase 2 clinical studies until reproductive toxicity studies were conducted and some evidence of effectiveness had become available. So basically, phase 1, we're not even testing effectiveness, we're testing toxicity. That would just totally exclude all women who have the capacity to ever have a child. This recommendation was applied to any premenopausal female, but explicitly did not apply to females with life-threatening diseases. And the policy was developed at the time, as described in multiple papers on it, to reflect societal interests in protecting vulnerable populations. And I think it really comes to this question of whether restriction of enrollment actually is protective and whether that's beneficial for vulnerable so-called populations. So a gender line keeps a woman not on a pedestal, but in a cage was, one of the major Supreme Court arguments for gender equity in employment law. But I think it's even important to think that, in particular for women living with HIV, these women are not on pedestals or cages. They are not in a position of power or protection. And the idea that excluding them from understanding what treatments are best for them is somehow empowering is just, I think, a real mischaracterization. So in biomedical science, I really believe that information is power. And without it, we can't really make the right recommendations about what to do and what the optimal therapies are and the true risks are of any interventions. So how does this intersect with HIV? So in 1981, the first 5 cases of PCP pneumonia were reported all among men in Los Angeles in the morbidity and mortality weekly report from the CDC, the MMWR, which was followed by reports from New York, San Francisco, and others. In the first 2 years that cases were being reported, there were only 43 reports of women with immunodeficiency syndromes. And so this sort of set us up to be in the second-class citizen status for women living with HIV, because most of the original cases were identified based on epidemiologic risk, and the epidemiologic risk factors that were identified were hemophilia, which is more prevalent in boys because it's of the X chromosome, and also in men who had sex with men. So if we look across the timeline of when the first cases were reported in 1981, the first HIV test and first AZT clinical trials in 1985, and the FDA approval of AZT in 1987, we can sort of get an idea of how women were being represented. So in the 1987 trial, which was one of the trials that led to the approval of AZT, 182 participants, of whom 13 were cisgender women. There was no identification of transgender participants. In the 1990 trial, there were 25 cisgender women participants and no identification of transgender participants. So really a very, very small number of women had ever been exposed to AZT at the time that it was approved for use in people living with HIV. So as we know, HIV was more new, there were more numbers of men living with HIV in the United States, and it was the leading cause of death among men ages 25 to 44 in 1993. But I'll also just point out that it was also the leading cause of death among Black women ages 25 to 44 in 1993. And those women, the ones who survived, but who were infected at that time, are now in our 50 plus category. They are our long-term survivors with HIV, and the people for whom thinking about how a curative intervention might release them from the burden that they've been carrying for these many years is I think, where the focus of this discussion should be. So the early cases were predominantly in males. The first reports of females were in the 1982 and a steady increase through the 80s and 90s. But despite the low prevalence, AIDS was a leading cause of death for young Black women in the United States in 1993. And these women, the ones who survived that original infection period, are now 50 plus. And since 2000, the proportion of women living with HIV, cisgender women, is about 23% and has remained about stable. There is very limited data on transgender women, and formal CDC guidance was issued on collecting this data only in 2012. And there are some regional differences in the prevalence of HIV infection among women. So in the 1990s, there was a big shift in policy in terms of inclusion. And part of this was that they reversed that 1977 recommendation and recommended the inclusion of women. Highlighting the importance of informed consent, which is, I'm sure, a topic that has been discussed many times in this forum, and what that really means. Understanding pharmacokinetic data in different populations, including pregnant people, and then understanding the impact of menstrual status and hormone exposure. There was also created the Office for Research in Women's Health and the recommendation of inclusion of sex as a biological variable. So where does that leave us in HIV? So the bottom line is that seminal studies of HIV pathogenesis, the ones that showed immune activation, that show a lot of other features, included few or no women. Patient advocacy has been a key driver of HIV research, and gender dynamics in the epidemic have limited cis and transgender women's participation in that community effort to drive HIV research. And changes in regulatory policy over time have shifted to favor to include the inclusion of women in trials. However, when we look across HIV trials, as shown here in a paper that was published in 2016, although the burden of infection is slightly more females than males worldwide, the representation of women in trials of antiretrovirals, trials of vaccines, cure trials, and latency reversal trials is really minimal representation of females across all those types of studies. So should we care? And what is the evidence that there's relevance of sex or gender to HIV pathogenesis? And I'll just pause at this moment to say, I've been using the term women in a kind of loose way, in general referring to cisgender women. And the reason for that is because during the time period that I was discussing, there was actually no collection of data about transgender women. And in many scientific reports, sex and gender were considered as the same thing. Hopefully we have now evolved past that and understand that, sex is something that's assigned typically based on anatomy and chromosomes, and gender is a person's experience in the world and has multiple intersections with both hormone exposure, but also other social dynamics. But I think that the bottom line is both of these things, sex and gender, are impacted by the environment, by your chromosome complement, by which hormones you're exposed to, whether or not those hormones are the hormones that would be predicted by your chromosomes or not. And then also socio-behavioral factors that go into gender identity. And all of these things combine to produce outcomes. And we should hesitate to assign a specific association with sex or gender until we actually have data. And so I think at this point, what I try to pursue in my scientific work and in any clinical studies is identifying people for how they identify, and then look at the relevant features that may impact their outcomes. Because I want to one day sit in an office and be able to counsel someone sitting opposite from me as to what the right interventions are for them, depending on their menopausal status, on whether they're cis or transgender, what their current hormone exposure status is, all of those different things that feed into clinical outcomes. And that's the goal where we really have to be moving towards. And these crude categories are never going to quite capture that. So taking that as a given, let's think a little bit about some of the biological factors that impact sex differences. So there are a lot of different things. I'm going to focus on just a few of them today. Certainly for cisgender men and women, there are anatomic differences that drive differences in risk of acquisition. There's also genetic differences. So women have 2 X chromosomes. Men have an X chromosome, that long chromosome here, and also a short Y chromosome, which females don't have at all. But then there's also some other differences in epigenetics and immune cell phenotypes. And then superimposed on top of all of these things are sex hormones. So here I've shown estradiol, one of the sex hormones, but there are many. There's testosterone, progesterone, estrogen. All of these things impact gene transcription and affect things like, obviously cause changes in the reproductive organs like breast development and things like that, but also have impacts on the immune cell compartment. So does any of this matter for HIV? And so what we can see from broad clinical trials is there's differences in risk of acquisition. That's probably a large part of that is mediated by anatomy. But there's also differences in complications and comorbidity. So increase in relative amount of risk for cardiovascular disease, cerebrovascular disease, or strokes, and cognitive vulnerability and frailty in females living with HIV as compared to males living with HIV. And this data is mostly from cisgender women. So this suggests that the burden of having HIV in terms of what other risks it gives you is higher for cisgender women. What does that say for transgender women? Do they have the cardiovascular risk of a cisgender woman with HIV or of a man with HIV, or how do those two things intersect, and how can we best stratify in terms of recommending things like statins or other interventions that might reduce their risk, and how do we really get towards personalizing medicine for every individual? Another key difference is in HIV set point viral load. So back in the early epidemic, it was identified that women progressed to AIDS at a lower set point viral load than males. And at the time, treatment guidelines were partially based on your set point viral load. So for men, cisgender men here, 78% of them were eligible to start antiretroviral therapy based on their viral load, whereas women who were going to develop AIDS, only 37% of them were even eligible based on their viral load, because we didn't understand that there was a difference, that there was a lower dose of HIV that had the same impact on your CD4 cell decline. So that's another example from the past where it's sort of a caution to us to say, okay, wait, are we sure that these things are the same across populations, or when do we need to start to think about differences? And so this is depicted here. The females are a little bit lower, but despite being a little bit lower, their CD4 counts go down at just the same rate. And an important thing to consider as we think about curative interventions, what are other differences where there might be a threshold difference between females and males, but the same risk of an adverse event or likelihood of having a cure. I think one other thing that's actually quite interesting is that the rates of spontaneous viral control, so those very rare individuals who control HIV without antiretroviral therapy, are substantially higher in females, cisgender females, as compared to cisgender males across multiple different cohorts and in different settings. And so this raises the question of what is different? Is there a genetic component? Is there a hormone component? Is there something that's combining to make it more likely that that individual would control HIV? And if so, what can we learn from that? And so if one group has an advantage, then the key thing is to figure out what the advantage is and to try to replicate that advantage for the other individuals who don't have it at baseline. And this is, I think, an area where we are sort of understudied. Now, Linda actually specifically asked me to talk about this paper, which we had just, is actually now published in just a couple months ago, where we were specifically looking at whether or not there was a sex chromosome impact on a difference in set point viral load. So in this beautiful study that was published in Science in 2010, they looked at the major genetic determinants. So when I say genetic determinants, I mean, is there a specific gene that makes it more likely that you're going to have a lower HIV viral load and that you're going to actually be an HIV controller? So the way they do this is they collect 9,000 people and they look at all of their genes and they see if any of the genes actually associate with HIV control. And what we found from this study is shown here. So across the bottom here are all the chromosomes. Everybody has 23 chromosomes in two pairs. So you have 23 and 23, 46 total. And each of those dots is like a gene. And if you rise above this little dotted line, it means that that gene is more commonly observed in someone who has elite control. And what you can see here is there's this whole screaming little stack of dots right here on chromosome 6, and that's associated with a specific immune marker that makes you more likely to be a controller of HIV. So this was great work, very helpful. Unfortunately, we can't change that immune marker. It's not one that we could just add into people who don't have it, but it was a really landmark study. But I'm pointing here that I told you everyone has 23 chromosomes, and this only looks at 22. And that's because they did not look at the sex chromosome. So they didn't look at the X and they didn't look at the Y. Does that matter? Well, X chromosome has a lot of immunoregulatory genes and other genes that are important in HIV responses, including TLR7. Some of you may have heard that talked about as a potential target for cure interventions. It's actually encoded on the X chromosome, and they didn't even look to see if variations in those genes would matter. So what we did in work with Paul McLaren and Candy Vergara was look at the same original set of data of 9,000 individuals, and then look specifically to see whether there were genes on the sex chromosomes that mattered, and also whether there were genes that differed between females and males. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole details of this study because it would involve lots of plots with lots of little dots, but I will show one. So these types of plots are called Manhattan plots because if they have a lot of signals, it looks like a skyline. And what I'm showing you here is a Miami plot, which is a Manhattan plot with a nice reflection in the ocean. So you see both the top and the bottom. And the top of the plot here is the males, and the reflection down here is the females. And what you can see here is there's genes that show up with nice little stacks rising above this red line in the males that do not show up in the females. And specifically, there's a new gene cluster here on chromosome 19 that didn't show up in the overall group. So usually when you have a big group and you separate it out, you get weaker. You can't identify things that you could identify in the big group. In this case, separating the group out by sex, cisgender male, cisgender female, we actually revealed a signal in the males only that we could not see in the big group overall. And so we're now doing some work on that specific locus to see if that is specifically involved in HIV viral load set points in males and how that might feed back in. I'm not going to tell you too much about these specific genes, but I will tell you that they were identified in a bunch of other in vitro studies where they did, in vitro means like just in a test tube. So they're not the first time these genes have been mentioned with respect to HIV, and the fact that they're coming out in this whole population study is very interesting. But it points to the fact that we can't just pretend that we're all the same. We don't always know where the sources of relevant difference are, and the only way we know is actually by looking. So to summarize this part, we found this novel new little gene-based association on chromosome 19 with set point viral load only in males, that there are regions in chromosome 1 and chromosome 6 that had different associations by sex, so that was higher viral load in females and lower viral load in males, and that also may suggest a difference in immune function. But I will also mention that this, which is the largest set of genomic data in people living with HIV, has a very limited analysis because there was a very small group of females. So there were only about 100 female controllers in this group of more than 800 controllers that was analyzed, even though females are more likely to be controllers. And why is that? Because females are more likely on the population base to be controllers, but they're not more likely to enroll in clinical trials. And that's where we have work to do and space to fill in, where we need to repeat studies, we need to do things to confirm and potentially identify things that we didn't know because we just simply weren't looking. I have this like pet idea that like every study published before a certain time should be like, you know, T cell activation is associated with HIV progression, in men, because most of those studies really had greater than 90% male enrollment. And now we publish studies where we say in women, but there has to be like that equal caveating. It's not like this is true and this is only true in women. It's like this is true in a population of mostly males, and this is true in a population of females. So now I'll just fast forward to cure a bit. Many of you who have heard talks before have probably heard that in addition to that difference in untreated HIV, there's also a difference in the reservoir, where there appears to be lower levels of HIV activity in females on suppressive antiretroviral therapy, and also lower levels of inducible replication competent virus by QVOA. In some work that I did with John Karn, we found that the estrogen receptor, ESR1, was actually involved in suppressing HIV latency. So that if you expose T cells to estrogen ex vivo, so which means you take them out of the body and you do things to them. Here we took cells out. When they're resting, there's no HIV. If we stimulate the T cells, we get HIV production. The red here is females, the blue here is males. If we do that same stimulation, but we do it with estrogen also in that culture dish, we really block the expression of HIV, in particular from cells from females. So this suggests to us that estrogen may actually be acting in part on how HIV and the HIV reservoir is controlled. And so why would this matter? Well, one thing is that estrogen levels are not static through life. So this is a paper from Sarah Gianella, John Karn, and others. We all worked looking at what happens to the reservoir over time in women as they transition through menopause. And what we find is that as estradiol levels are going down, activity of the reservoir is increasing in women living with HIV. And this is in some ways somewhat surprising. So I'll just highlight here that we're repeating this study in a longitudinal and expanded group, and actually hopefully we'll just get a grant funded that was just resubmitted. We're doing also analysis of the immune cells on the single cell level to see what's happening to the immune responses. And there's also a new study in the ACTG called the HOT study, where they're looking at treatment of menopause, and we're going to, paired with the studies on actual hot flash symptoms and treatments of menopause, we're also going to look at what's happening to the reservoir to try to get both pieces of information at the same time. And that HOT study is led by Dr. Sarah Barris and Dr. Michael Yin. Then finally, I will just say that one other feature that I think is really important is looking at how these chromosomes and sex hormones interact. And so here, the focus in part is on changes across the lifespan, but also on transgender individuals. So the risk of HIV acquisition is 14 times higher for transgender women. And according to CDC survey data, this is a highly vulnerable population with low access to resources, high experiences with homelessness, and limited engagement with healthcare providers. So one of the critical questions for this population is, what is the impact of exposure to hormones on virologic features, chronic inflammation, and the risk of comorbidities? And how do we parse these apart? So some of the work that we've been doing on this particular question has been with Beatrice Grinstein and Amelia Jalal in their beautiful Transcendendo cohort in Rio de Janeiro, They have a cohort of transgender women who've been followed for a long time and excellent engagement with their clinic, some for preventive services for HIV and some for HIV care service. And so what we did was we prospectively recruited individuals with a trans feminine identity who were assigned male sex at birth and collected demographic characteristics, and then also enrolled them half with HIV, half not living with HIV, and half currently taking gender affirming hormones and half who are not. Because a lived gender experience introduces lots of social and other stress factors that may impact your immune responses. And we can't assume that all of that is just due to hormone exposure. It may also be the lived gender identity. So what we're trying to parse out here was everybody has a trans feminine identity. Some people have current hormone exposure. How can we sort of sort out what is impacting different immunologic and virologic features? And so we've done some initial analyses on this group, and what we found is that exposure to exogenous hormones appears to have a larger impact on immune cell phenotypes when individuals are also living with HIV. So it appears to that inflammation, those inflammation questions appear to be more significant when you're living with HIV and on hormone therapy. Feminizing hormone treatment did not increase T cell activation in our study. And also there were multiple markers of cellular metabolism. So what that means is how you use sugar and how you make energy that were changed by exposure to hormones and may be important for HIV reservoir and immune activation. So just to summarize what I've basically tried to motor through very quickly is there's lots of historical features of the HIV epidemic itself and also the FDA policy guidelines that biased research focus away from the impact of sex and gender on outcomes. And we just need to keep that as a background. And it's not necessarily malicious intent, but it is systematic and baked in and needs to be considered when we look at the sort of breadth of research that's been done. Natural history studies, so studies where people do not have treatment, demonstrate that there are differences in phenotype of spontaneous control, those rare events, and also the viral set point between cisgender males and females. Less is known about transgender individuals in those settings. You need pretty large populations to establish what a set point viral load is, and there have not been cohorts adequately sized to do that. Genetic and hormonal mechanisms may be important to these effects. We have evidence for both, that there are genes that act differently in males versus females, and also that hormones actually directly impact some of the measures of HIV that we are looking at, and that the relative influence of genetic and hormonal impacts may shift over the lifespan. I didn't cover it here at all, but there's some very interesting data coming out on differences in risk of in utero infection between male or female fetuses, and then differences in childhood development of control that may be different also between males and females. There was some data presented about that at the IAS meeting just a few weeks ago. But I think all of this comes down to, I think, a message that's across the cure field, which is that if we're going to do cure, we have to have really personalized and precision approaches. One size fits all is unlikely to work for something of this magnitude. And representation in studies is going to be crucial. And it has to be real representation, not token. Can't be one person in a study of 10. And if it's going to be one person in a study of 10, I say do the study without that one person and then repeat it with 10 of the second phenotype. Don't mistake tokenism for actual representation. And I think that if we can accomplish these things, there's just so much to be gained, both for everyone, because if you identify a protective pathway in one population, you may well be able to replicate that in someone else. So none of this research is really only for one population or another. It's really just that the information broadly gives us so much power. So my acknowledgement slides got cut off, but I do want to thank my collaborators on the genetics study and also my collaborators in the Transcendendo cohort, and also all of the people living with HIV who've contributed to my research and my patients who continue to inspire me to do better. So I will stop there.
Eileen, if you could give us one sentence about what you explained about the viral set point difference between men and women, and try to explain for us what you mean by viral set point. And the second question would be about the reservoir of what differences do you actually see between men and women and menopausal women?
Great. So set point, what that means is when you first get infected with HIV, most people will have a dramatic rise in their HIV viral load. And it will go up maybe 1 million, maybe 2 million, some people 100,000. Then it kind of comes down a little bit and then it sort of levels out. And that's your set point. So if you don't get treated for a period of time, a couple of years to many years, it will hover in that region. For many people, it'll be around 70,000 copies, and it can go from 50 to 80. And if you get a cold, it might go even higher, but it generally will settle out and oscillate in that region. And what they identified was men were oscillating up around 77,000 and women were oscillating around 17,000. And both of those populations were developing AIDS at the same rate. So what it means is the dose of HIV that was leading to development of AIDS and loss of CD4 cells was much lower in women, but it wasn't protecting them from losing their CD4 cells. So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then from the reservoir perspective, what we're looking at in the reservoir, so with the reservoir, you're thinking of these T cells that are floating around with HIV just sitting there silently. Occasionally, it will express a little bit of itself, and we can measure them with all these different fancy things that people are always giving cute names to. So, and say a little bit of HIV production has occurred. If we use those ultrasensitive methods and look at 26 women, cisgender women with HIV, and 26 cisgender men with HIV, we see more little bits of activity from the cisgender men than we see from the cisgender women. Those are all premenopausal women. Now, if we look across time in a separate group, we see that those little tiny indicators of activity, which are not like viral replication, not, having a viral load, just like little ultrasensitive, oh, look, it just raised a flag briefly, that increases over time in women as they progress through menopause. So that suggests to us that something is changing in the overall milieu, whether it's inflammatory or hormone mediated, as women go through that part of the life course. So, and anyone have follow-up or clarification questions?
I don't see a lot. I think, was your hormone replacement therapy question answered, Dawn?
Not yet. I was actually just going to jump in and
Okay, you go ahead.
Yeah, and bring up, there were a couple of questions in the chat. And so one of them was from Dawn, and she was asking, is there enough information to suggest that women living with HIV should be on hormone replacement therapy? Or did I say that backwards, Dawn?
Sorry, I couldn't get myself off mute. Postmenopausal women.
Postmenopausal women, sorry, yes.
And obviously that's a really general question for a very complex issue. I mean, what if somebody was diagnosed and has only been being treated for a couple of years versus decades? And, there's a whole, obviously, layers of complexity. But in general, as people are thinking about polypharmacy and what you choose to use, is HRT something that should be kind of moving up the list for postmenopausal women?
So I think, the story in HRT, or hormone replacement therapy for postmenopausal women, has evolved a lot in the last decade in particular. So many years ago, there were studies where people were postmenopausal women were started on hormone replacement therapy with estrogen, and with the thought that it would protect them, because we know that premenopausal women have lower rates of heart disease than men. So let's just make them look like those women by just giving them estrogen. And shock of all shocks, that did not work. And there were an increase in adverse events. So since that study, which is the Women's Health Initiative, there's been a sort of avoidance of hormone therapy in postmenopausal women. There was one extremely important detail about that study that was underappreciated at the beginning. The women enrolled in that study had been postmenopausal for about a decade. So it was not perimenopausal women who were having hot flashes and going through a transition who had their estrogen levels smoothed out. It was women who had not seen estrogen for years who were suddenly re-exposed. And that is not a good idea. Use of estrogen therapy in the perimenopausal period is likely beneficial for a lot of different reasons, setting aside HIV as a consideration. And keep in mind, I'm not a gynecologist, but these are regular questions that we think about with our female patients all the time. So I think the question is very nuanced in that, it depends on where you are. Are you peri? Are you way post? It depends on your other suite of risk factors, including cardiovascular risk factors, history of breast cancer, family history of breast cancer or ovarian cancer, all sorts of other things would play into a decision about continuing exposure to estrogen or not. But I think that the bottom line is, in general, we need to be a lot more focused on using estrogen in particular for people who are perimenopausal, because the Women's Health Initiative, despite its very nice name, actually did a dramatic disservice to women because of that misunderstanding of when it's appropriate to use estrogen therapy. Does that answer your question?
Excellent. There's two more questions in the chat that I want to kind of get to real quickly, and then we'll jump over to Dawn and Waheeda. So Michael asked a little earlier, is there a difference between CAR1 and CAR6?
And I meant the chromosome 1 and 6.
Okay.
Like that when you were saying that's where the action seemed to lie, like, or the reaction seemed to lie. Are they related in any way, the chromosomes?
So that's a great question. So in general, when you see two chromosomes that have those inverse effects, one of the possibilities is that they're two genes that work cooperatively that are just in different places. Because it turns out that even if you have all these genes that are, part of a pathway, they may be located on lots of different chromosomes. So your point is a good one, is that it could be that those genes on the two different chromosomes are interacting with each other. And there's some more fancy kind of math that you can do to try and sort that out. At this point, we don't know the answer to that. The chromosome 6 ones are the ones that are most well studied. And I should also just mention that, we really do also have a minimal representation of all genetic backgrounds in this study. The cohort, although with 9,000 people, does not represent the global diversity of genetic elements. Mm-hmm. And so there's another major limitation there.
Right. Thank you.
And then the other question was, is there a change in the reservoir activity among cisgender men and women after exposure to ART is observed?
So this is a good question. So when we measure reservoir activity, we, by definition, usually have to be doing it on people who are suppressed with antiretroviral therapy. And the reason for that is that if we look before you're on antiretroviral therapy, some of that is productive infection, so just active infection. And we have to wait until things have quieted down before we can confirm that the only thing we're looking at is the reservoir. So to the question, that's exactly what we observed. Those are people who are on antiretroviral therapy and have been suppressed for an adequate period of time. In this case, I think the minimum was 18 months. And so then when we looked at those very small residual levels of activity, we were only looking in people who were already on antiretroviral therapy. And that was where we saw the difference. So more activity in males than in females. And those were all premenopausal females.
Excellent. Excellent. So before we move any further, like I said at the very beginning, there's always something to be learned on this webinar. I can see clearly in the chat, a lot of people are expressing that they've learned a lot just in this very short 25 minutes that you've been speaking. And it's incredibly important information because there is so little information out there as it relates to women and hormones and the difference in who we are and our genetic makeup and all of that. So I absolutely appreciate that. What I'm going to do is please continue to put your questions in the chat. We're going to come back to those some more at the end. Michael's going to help me with that because he's really awesome with it. And what we want to do right now is kind of hear a little bit from Dawn and Waheeda about their experiences as it relates to being long-term survivors and as it relates to cure and cure research and involvement in cure research and why that may be important. So Dawn, why don't we, I'm sorry, we didn't do a formal bio for anyone because we want to make sure that we stay on time and we get as much information to you all as possible. Dawn, in case you don't know, is the founder of the Well Project and has been heavily involved in all things women and HIV related, and is one of my personal sheroes because obviously. And Waheeda has also been doing this for a very long time, and she's with the Reunion Project. Well, yeah, I'm not certain what your title is. I apologize.
I'm the Director of Community Engagement at the Reunion Project.
Absolutely.
And I need to say that I'm co-chair emeritus of a couple of CABs. One is a Cure CAB in Philadelphia at the Wistar Institute, the Beat Delaney Collaborative. I'm also and I say emeritus because I'm still working with these cabs, even though I'm no longer with them. I need to say, and I'm not a researcher, and Dr. Scully, thank you so much for giving us so much information, and very easy to uptake as well. I remember 20 years ago, I was trying to make some analysis about when they used to ask you about medication, they would ask you how much you weighed. And according to how much you weighed, that's how much the dose of medicine they would give you. And I remember once being at Johns Hopkins, and I can't remember why I was there, but I asked a young lady to come to the stage. I'm 4'11" for those who don't know. People think I'm a big person until they see me. I'm very short. There was a woman there smaller than me. I asked her to come to the stage, and I asked this really big guy to come to the stage at the same time. And I'm like, look, these two people take the same amount of medicine. How does that happen, right? And one was male, again, one was male, one was female. And so I always knew in my gut that there had to be something different for women and men. There had to be something different for ages. There had to be something different for weight. I kind of knew that. That was kind of common sense for me. I'm not a researcher, but I'm so glad to hear now that there is being research done on the differences in women and men and our hormones, and our hormones. I need to say, I've been postmenopausal for 20 years. I'll be 70 on my birthday in next week. I'll be 70 years old, and I went through the menopause at like around 54. I got diagnosed at 49 with AIDS, with an AIDS diagnosis. That was my first time getting tested. And then a few years later, I was in menopause. So I'm glad that Dawn asked that question, about what happens if we introduce estrogen therapy into women, who have been postmenopausal. And I see that it's not ideal for me from your answer, but I'm just glad to see that these conversations are happening, that we are seeing that there are differences. I'm sorry that there's been such a minimal amount of women participation in studies over the years. And I think that one of the things that I want to say that from the women I've spoken to, they pretty much want to know, like, is everything going to be safe? Where we're going at, is it going to be as safe as where we are now? Is the cure going to be safer than taking the regimen? So want to just talk a little bit about safety concerns. So that's where I am right now. I'll pass the mic to Dawn, who I also love and admire. And we love the Well Project as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Waheeda, and happy birthday. Just kind of sit with that for a minute, 70. That's pretty cool. I'm thrilled to be here. Eileen, I can listen to you indefinitely. I always learn something and have 100 questions, but I'll save some of them and you'll get a long email later. But I want to call out something that you started with and that I so deeply appreciate you saying from the get-go. And that is that by looking at women, by asking these questions, by really digging in, we learn something about everyone. This is not just whether or not we think it's worth asking the questions in women. Do we really expect to see anything that really warrants any changes in our behavior, et cetera, et cetera? This is really because we understand the picture for everyone better, the more access to information we have across the spectrum. So I really appreciate you calling that out. And also I appreciate all of the male identifying folks on this call who logged in to have this conversation. So that's the first thing. The other thing that shows what a kind of dinosaur I am in all of this is this idea about personalized medicine. I think it's probably 15 years ago, we started talking about the brave new world we were going to be living in, where we did therapeutic drug monitoring, PDM. And, I imagine there's a number of you on here who can remember those conversations, but it was really about being very personalized in our therapy approaches just around HIV specifically. And I think that kind of fell by the wayside. We had a lot of complexity with the combination regimens and frankly, transitioning from the kind of acute crisis model of HIV management to the chronic care model. But I do think that it's time to circle back around. I think in order, not only in treatment, but also in cure, I totally agree. This is not a one size fits all issue. And I can think of nuance in every bit of information that we have that is, Waheeda's comment just now was perfect in this. Menopause happened for me 20 years ago, but it's easy for us in our attempts to get information out to just say postmenopausal women, as if postmenopausal women are a monolith. There's just one thing that is a postmenopausal woman. And I can tell you menopause appears to go on for basically ever, but at least in my experience, but I think I'm probably pretty close to a postmenopausal woman as well as anyone can define it. And, menopause is entering the great black box. Once menopause hits, I kind of half jokingly say to friends, although this is not really a joke, for the first 30 years of living with HIV, no matter what I had when I went to the doctor, had something to do with HIV. The last 5 years, now that menopause has come around, no matter what it is, it's menopause. And now the default on all my problems are now menopause and not HIV, which is a little ironic if you think about it. But anyhow, so I think that Dr. Scully raised a number of things that I hope piqued everyone's interest. I think that there is no clear mandate in my mind to have broader participation in cure research than the conversation we're having right now. How critically important it is to get our friends, the people we care for, others involved in research on a whole variety of levels. And I've been a strident, ardent, whatever you want to call it, advocate for participation in research since the very beginning.
I have a physical therapy.
Linda.
I'm about three.
Uh-oh.
Linda.
Sure, you're muted, please.
I just did it.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Poor Linda's going to have us all involved. Anyhow, and I think that where we are now, as we try to understand some of the really important work around reservoirs, as a person living with HIV, it's incredibly exciting to have the Geneva patient be rolled out at the International AIDS meeting just recently. And, this idea that in those folks who have had stem cell transplants, we see some, at least, possibility of eradicating or at least long-term remission of HIV. And but as somebody who's been taking antiretroviral therapy for 30 plus years, you would really like to know what's going to happen for those of us who have been maximally suppressed for now decades. And at what point do we see changes in those reservoirs? And unless we participate in the research, we aren't going to get the answers to those questions. So I'm going to throw it back to Bridgette because I have like a rolling list of things that came up, mostly because the things I thought I was going to talk to you about how important it is to consider statins, et cetera, seem to be sidelined a little bit on the conversation that Eileen just raised up for all of us. So I'm going to throw it back to Bridgette and she can get us on track.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And actually, both you and Waheeda, happy birthday, Waheeda, early. I love you to death too. Raised some really good points about some of the differences between men and women. And really, for me, one of the things that comes up, and I'll come to it, is getting women involved in some of these trials. But there's a question about does menopause increase frailty in women?
So frailty definitely increases with age. And I think if you do age matching and have people with the same chronological age, but menopause or not, that would be the way to answer that question. I don't know for sure if that's been studied. I think it's hard to disentangle chronological age from reproductive age in that way, but I would bet someone did, and I will look, and if I find the answer, I'll send it along.
And I think to Dawn's point too is the difference between when you're living with HIV, everything is about HIV versus everything becoming about menopause. I'm at an age right now, I'm 50, very firmly 50, about to be 51. And I had my first for real hot flash, and I thought I was going to die. And so everything between, it really does become, is this the HIV or is this regular aging? And so conversations like this are critically important to be able for us to understand and be able to manage, because we get to a point where we think we're managing really well, and then something changes, and not being able to find the answers that we need are really frustrating. Linda had a question. Do you want to ask it, Linda, or do you want me to just go ahead and ask it?
Yeah, just real quickly, and I'm really sorry. I've been waiting for that doctor to call me for 3 days, and of course he called me during this call. I didn't realize I was not muted. But I wanted to talk about clinical trials for a sec and accrual, and I was really fascinated. I never thought about the tie to thalidomide back in the day, and how that really has made such a lasting mark. But I also wanted to say that that may be unintentional on the part of the FDA, but for years it really has been intentional to avoid women in trials from the pharmaceutical companies. I mean, it's been much easier to get gay white men with no kids and lives that are not as complicated. So we've spent many years trying to get them to allow women in important trials and earlier. In other words, we've been more successful in the phase 4 trials, but by that time drugs are approved. So we need that data on women in phase 3 trials to know whether we should know about weight in phase 2, but to know about, that's our first opportunity to open the trials up to see what's going to happen to people, men, women, otherwise, everybody, as far as side effects and efficacy and all that sort of thing. So, and I also wanted to know from all 4 of you ladies, what do you think we could do? Because I know that there's a lot of mistrust in a lot of communities about trials, and what we could do to, so many of us in Cure have really wanted to make a change and make it be different this time, with Cure research. And we don't see it because I think, I hate to say this, but I think sometimes women have more sense about, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to wait and see what happens on this, But if we don't get women involved, then we're never going to know what happens with women. So it's kind of going around in circles. So I would love to hear you comment about how we should do this and what ways you feel are most efficient and worthwhile.
Dawn, I see you're ready to go.
Well, first, yeah, I am definitely chomping at the bit here. I appreciate the question, Linda, and but I think first and foremost, one of the things that we have got to begin to address is that it's not just the women. We have for decades kind of assumed that women are not in clinical trials, partially because of the structural barriers, but that women won't be willing to participate. And I think that what we learned with the early Cure research analysis on what was happening is that there were gatekeepers. The barriers were actually the researchers, the providers, and the folks who would potentially either be interested in actively engaging women in research, and also the people who would explain, describe, make available the opportunity to participate in research. And I have had countless conversations where funders have told me that they have tried over and over and over again to get their grantees to consider doing more aggressive work to reach out to women. And they have said, no, it's not worth it. You haven't proven to me that this is really important. I don't have access. All of the reasons you can imagine. So I think that a piece of this is certainly that women are either not aware or choose not to use their time, their bodies, or whatever this way. But there is also a much, at least as significant a piece, if not more, about the barriers, which are really kind of considered soft barriers because they're influencers, they're gatekeepers, they're the people that would tell women. I mean, I think probably 8 years ago we did a survey among, I think, 500 or 600 women, and almost 60% had never been offered the opportunity to participate in a trial of any kind. So I don't know that that's radically changed, frankly. And so I think that this is a multifaceted issue and a challenge. And to Eileen's point, we should call it out, not just call out the number of women that have participated, but call out when research is only relevant to the researched population. And that's not something that we have been able to really kind of formally institutionalize and make kind of consistent across the board, both in publications and in conferences. I'll stop there.
Go ahead, Waheeda.
Yeah, I was going to say that I always challenge women to be trailblazers, because we have to make our own paths. And I've always challenged women to be more than beneficiaries of aid services. I've always challenged women to be a part of the solution. But I also know that HIV is a disease that makes us quiet and wants to make us fade in the background. So it's not for everybody, and then I also remind people, because people always use the word guinea pig. I don't want to be the guinea pig. Everybody thinks they're going to be a guinea pig. But some of the drugs that we use today, we weren't there for the studies anyway. We use aspirin, we use Tylenol, those sort of things that we use. We weren't in those studies either. We just got lucky that they happened to work for us. And then another thing is that, that our medical providers and people we call not that the medical providers are gatekeepers, but sometimes they are, but we have to make sure that everybody's getting the same message at the same time. And I'm saying that because I want to talk about U equals U, where my white counterparts knew that U equals U 4 years before I knew that U equaled U. And what was the big secret? And then when I finally got that message, someone said to me, Waheeda is only saying that the drugs work. And I'm like, yeah, that's why we take them. We're hoping that they work, right? But I didn't learn it from my medical provider. And I thought we was cool. I've had this same woman with my medical provider for years. I thought we were like here, like right here, right? And I didn't hear that from her. And when I did hear it somewhere else, and I text her and asked her, is this true, what I'm hearing? And she's like, yes, it's true. And I'm like, well, we're going to have a talk when I get home. We've never had that talk. I didn't want to hold her feet to the fire because it was information I had found, and I found the whole campaign and all the folks that were working on it and things like that. And the information that came from the research is now out there for everybody. But so there's been this history where some things are told to some people, and that same information is held back from other people. So there is a murky area for not just women, but for Black women, so there's different layers to being to where we don't see transparency. But again, I've been advocating for study participation for years. And I still do, even to this day. I still do some stuff where I'm advocating for people to be involved in studies, because some people will do it and others won't. But you have to give people the opportunity. You have to give them access to the information and the opportunity, and then allow them to make their own choices. But again, for women, we have to trail out. We have to make trails for ourselves because they are close to us. I don't know why they're so afraid of us, but yeah, all we're going to do is multiply whatever you give us.
That's definitely a great point. And then go ahead, Dr. Scully, and then I'll go after you. Absolutely, go ahead.
No, please call me Eileen, but I just wanted to make sure to say this, that one place to hold people's feet to the fire, please, is on the weight gain research, because the early studies in this show that the weight gain is most pronounced in women, and those studies were in sub-Saharan Africa, and they were Black women, and also in studies in the US. And then there's that field is incredibly complicated now. Everybody's like, oh, I switched this to that, and then I did it twice on Tuesday, and this person gained 2 pounds. but there's mixing of, like, one of the studies at IAS was 70% male, and they didn't see an impact from their intervention. But how much would we expect to see if those aren't the people? So this is just a plea from, like, not cure related, but like hold people to tell you how many women are there and who are they looking at.
Yeah. I've been saying for forever, and the people here in my area know, the farm reps here in my area know, because I say it at every single meeting, that I gained weight, and you can't tell me it was return to health, because I wasn't that unhealthy. You can't tell me, because nothing else in my life changed. My eating habits didn't change. My exercise habits didn't change. None of that changed other than my HIV medication. But that's, anyway, I want to keep us focused on cure. And so there's some people in the comments that are asking about how to see this webinar. It will be available on YouTube. The whole series of these webinars up to this point are available on YouTube. And I encourage you to go back and watch them, because there's so much information there about the basics of cure, what the different types of cure are, how the different types of cure work, why they're important. And on this idea of women being involved in trials, not just, Waheeda, what you were saying about the information being there, but there has to be, I think, cultural competence in dealing with this is really important. And Linda, that goes to your point about misinformation and disinformation. It's making sure that people have not only good information, but that we are looking at the whole picture when it comes to being involved in a trial is very stressful. For someone who's been taking their medication steadily for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, you're now asking them, in most cases with cure research, to interrupt their medication to then take part in this trial. But are we adequately informing and explaining how long you're going to not be on your medication, what the possibility is that you're going to develop resistance, because that's what a lot of people have questions about. So it is giving the information in such a way that it makes sense and it lowers the anxiety of being a part of it. It's not one size fits all. You can't go to the same people that you go to, i.e. gay white men, no offense, and expect that a woman's response, a Black woman's response, is going to be the same as that male response. So it's not just the information, it's the information delivery in such a way that we all understand it. And I can see from the chat that most of this is brand new information, and that's why these things are so important. Dawn, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I lost my train of thought because I was reading questions, sorry. But I think that one of the things that we need to be really mindful about is who we fund for the research and how we kind of make noise about what it means to participate in research. And at the same time, I think we also have to be, you're talking about how stressful it can be to be in cure research. I think we need to help each other and our peers understand that there are baby steps also to being involved in research. You could do blood draws, and people could then do reservoir work. There's stuff that can be done. That doesn't mean, you have to go off your drugs and risk everything if that's not what you're prepared to do. So I continue to look for kind of inroads for people to kind of give it a try, get involved, see what about they like and don't like. Every study is different, but there are all kinds of opportunities for our experience, our voices, to really kind of help shape how we move forward. I'm doing a couple of different studies right now where I'm just, I'm doing blood draws every 6 months, and and that cell collection is helping them kind of do some analyses that I'm actually not really particularly involved in, but I feel good about the fact that information, they've got an HIV positive woman who's been positive for 35 years and maximally suppressed for 25 years. They can use that to begin to inform some of the hypotheses for bigger studies, hopefully, and that kind of thing. So I would just say to everyone out there, I don't care how you identify, to consider what part of research do you think you can participate in? And it can be, it can be surveys, it can be blood draws, it can be all different kinds of things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if you want to participate in cure research, you have to go off your meds.
I'm muted. Sorry.
Bridgette,
Excellent point. And that was much more eloquently than what I meant, which is just making sure that people know what's out there and giving people the opportunity to make informed decisions. And as a nurse, my favorite term, because it matters, shared decision making about whether or not they want to be involved in the research and what types of involvement they want to have. The chat is like hot right now. We have,
since my mic is on, can I just say something? One of the things that I've been reading about when you how quick the reservoirs come back, like it could be like as quick as 2 to 4 weeks, and that's for me. And I've talked with you about this before, Bridgette. That's pretty scary for me. I'm like, that fast? I've been taking medicine for 30 years, and I could stop taking it for 2 weeks, and it's coming back. So there are those of us who do have those sort of concerns. I want to say, as I'm getting older, I don't know. I figure I'm going to live. Well, I know I'm going to live almost forever because I'm living on purpose. I need to say that. But I figure that physically, I'll probably be around for another 10 or 20 years. And I just wonder if this is this something that a woman of my age should be thinking about? Are they allowing women who are 70 years old to be in cure research studies?
Well, can I just jump in for a second and say that along with this webinar series, we're going to be doing a study for people that are 70 and older and their willingness to get into HIV cure trials. So we're going to leave it open to people of color first. We're going to make sure they get the first opportunity to enroll because there's only 30 people in the study. It's something that you interviews and questionnaires kind of thing, as opposed to a regular interventional study. But and I also wanted to say to Dawn that our big pitch, or my big pitch anyway, coming up here for the next time around for our annual DARE meeting, for instance, is to say to the doctors, you're going to have to start thinking out of the box with the way you design trials. I mean, we know we need these ATIs because we can't measure reservoirs, but we're starting to learn so much more about reservoirs than we did before. And there's got to be a way to design the trials differently, including letting people decide whether they want to be in these ATI sections of the trials, just like we had to have, spinal taps, and we had to have, this biopsy and that biopsy. And we started to let people, decide whether they want to actually participate in that and have a choice between that and not being in the trial at all. So in other words, we hear you with all of that. And we're really going to have to change the way we look at this. And it's just as simple as that. Just like we did in the beginning, it's just more complicated now.
Absolutely. Definitely. I see that there's some comments in the chat about age being limiting. Eileen, do you want to address that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'll just mention briefly that, one of the other gatekeepers for a lot of these studies is actually the FDA and what we're allowed to do and what's considered safe participants. So like sort of hearkening back to the earlier discussion. And I'll just point out that the thalidomide thing, actually, one of the things about that's so interesting is that the reason why there weren't more thalidomide babies in the United States was because there was a female official at the FDA who decided that the data was inadequate in women, and that's why it wasn't actually moved forward. So that one person stood in the way of a generational impact that was observed in Europe. But anyway, I digress. So as far as participation in older study of older individuals in general, it is true that there are age limitations. However, most of those don't apply to things like observational studies. And, for someone like Waheeda, I would say, knowing your body has had, continuous exposure to antiretroviral therapy and has developed its own unique reservoir, and understanding that reservoir can be accomplished by just taking your blood and doing nothing else to you, and understanding how your reservoir looks as compared to other people's reservoirs is incredibly useful. So there is so much space to be involved and present in research that is not going to require you. Because I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I would ever tell you that I would want you to go off your therapy. I like you just the way you are. And there are not participation in all trials is not for everyone. But I think there are so many ways to participate, whether it's in social sciences research, in outreach, or even just in blood draw sampling, longitudinal studies that can really be incredibly informative.
Definitely. So I just want to point out in the chat that a couple of people have put, Michael's put a link to the other webinar series. Jeff Taylor has suggested that folks can look up Elizabeth Barr to find some other research on women in HIV clinical trials. There's PubMed for studies to find some of those. Let's see. I want to try to capture some of this stuff so that folks are aware in case they're not paying attention to the chat. And I would actually suggest that you go back and take a look through the chat, because there's some really good suggestions and answers to questions that are in there. Dr. Scully's been putting answers in there as we go along. So those are there.
And Bridgette and Waheeda, I know you're a part of the United States Conference on HIV and AIDS and our session there, if you want to mention that, because I know.
Yep, just
there.
Yep. So we're going to be, if you are attending USCHA this year, our session is Friday, September 8th from 2 to 4. It's on long-term survivorship and HIV cure research. It's a community perspective. So we'll have a panel on that. We would love for you to come and join us there. And, participate in that part of the conversation. I want to point out that Dr. Scully mentioned at the beginning, I'm sorry, you said to call you Eileen. Eileen mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that without community, there's no research. And we need research as much as research needs us and the community to be a part of it. And so it is definitely a partnership. And so based on just what we're hearing in the webinar, there's a ton of ways to be involved. It doesn't necessarily have to mean blood and tissue. There are ways that you can get involved in observational studies, in studies about medication switches and changes. Many of us have changed medication over the course of our life, thriving with HIV. And so those are things that you can get involved in. So there are ways to be involved that don't necessarily involve your body parts, that are still meaningful and still matter. And so please look for that. Please go back. I have viewed the webinars that I've missed. Michael has done a great job of putting these together and making sure that they're available. So definitely go back and take a look at those. As I said, there's a lot of information on different types of cure, which we didn't talk a lot about here today. But one thing that I do want to ask you, Eileen, is about latency reversal. Can you talk a little, because you mentioned that in one of your slides, can you talk a little bit about what that is exactly?
Right. So latent means sleeping, right? So that is when the HIV has been put into our chromosome. So it's like any other gene, but it's not expressing itself. It's just sitting there. And that is considered latent. Now, if the cell is just floating around with that, no harm, no foul, nothing happens. Latency reversal is when HIV transcription turns on. And unlike a normal gene, which just produces itself and then does its job, then that turning on of HIV will produce virus, and that virus will infect other cells. So latency reversal is how the sleeping HIV wakes up. Now, the question is, why would we ever want to do that? Well, the reason why we'd ever want to do that is when it's just floating around with it silently, you can't tell that the cell has HIV at all. So there's no way to target it. There's no way to remove it. That little silent Trojan horse will just continue through the body. And so one of the ideas is to turn on HIV. And when you turn it on, then HIV proteins are made, and maybe we could identify that cell and just eliminate it. So that's why people would want to reverse latency. And so ideally, you would reverse latency while still taking your antiretroviral therapy. So you can't get a full new cycle. You can't go all the way through the life cycle and make a new infection. Just turn it on long enough, and the cell will basically raise a little flag and say, oops, I'm carrying HIV. And then the immune system or some other magical intervention would then eliminate that cell. And so it would no longer be floating around as the Trojan horse. Does that make sense?
Orbit had a question. Orbit, did you want to unmute and ask your question yourself?
Well, it's actually not a question, more of a statement. For those of you, many of you know me. Hi, Eileen. Hi, Michael. I am part of the ACTG AIDS Clinical Trial Group. We're a treatment network. Global Community Advisory Board. We have many members on here, Jeff and all. We are the network that has, since '87, focused on treatment. We have what is called transformative science group that specialize in certain research areas, such as cure, hepatitis, tuberculosis. The top priority right now with the ACTG is cure. And what I want to say as a community person, we need your voice in cure, the design of it, because a lot of the studies simply to get pure scientific data requires analytical treatment interruption. You will start hearing ATI. That is asking you to stop your medications for the research purpose. Your involvement, your input is critical to the designs, the ethical part, does it work, and everything. So as some people had asked, how can I get involved? I will say, just look up ACTG, it'll take you to the website. But I'm imploring, this is a call to action that all of us and all of our colleagues and contacts, the community really needs to be engaged in the development of the cure studies. We talked here, yes, you have to ask questions about women participation. And to the fellows who are on here, we have to also advocate for them, that as studies are coming out, protocol, ask the question, what are they doing to actively, and that's the word, actively engage women and unrepresented populations? Thank you.
So can
Thank
I
you
just
for that.
say, Orbit, that I just put a link in the chat that I put in every time we have one of these webinars. It actually is, it says www.hank, and there is a list of all the different AIDS networks and how to get in touch with them if you're interested in being not a participant in trials, but in the sort of community engagement that Orbit has just described, and involved in their cabs, on their protocol teams and all that, so you can have a direct voice with the people that actually make this stuff happen. So please take a look, and you might be interested. It's all kind of different sorts of prevention, vaccines, HIV cure, regular ACTG, sort of everything. So please take a look. We really need your help. Thank you, Orbit, for that lead.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So Michael has said that he will include the chat in with the email that he sends out, because a lot of you are asking. There's a lot of great information in there. I want to go ahead and give everyone an opportunity, because we have kept you past the 11 o'clock mark. So I want to give everyone an opportunity to give some last thoughts before we sign off. Jeff, I see your hand. Let me let you go ahead and go real quick before we move on to last thoughts.
Okay, thank you so much. Wanda London was on earlier, but I think she's left, so this is on her behalf. She's with UC San Diego, and they've got a study specifically for HIV positive women.
I'm still here.
Oh, you're here? Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's
Go
not
for
right.
it. You tell about the study. I posted it, the flyer in the
Yeah,
chat.
I see you did, and I appreciate it. And I'm just gonna post this information right here for the link to the information. But thanks, Jeff. And like you were saying, it's a study we're doing with Women Shine, and it's working with women. So I'm just going to briefly share this, because we've been on here forever. If I can just share the flyer, I'm sorry.
Jeff, put the flyer in the chat.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah. So it's basically, we're going to do a study. We work with women that are out of care, are challenging in care. And so I was listening to the study today, and it's really hits the point. We deal with women that are in volatile situations, stigma or lack of social support. And in the study, it's a whole year study, but it's online, and we collect information in four parts quarterly, and it's selected to be an intervention group. So they actually work with 2 cohorts and 2 peer navigators, and they meet online. I know it's a lot of information. Oh, and this is for women living with HIV and AIDS in California, and it's for cisgender women only. Oh, did I get it in, Jeff?
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing.
I only had a few minutes, and I didn't want to keep anyone over. But if you go to the poster that Jeff posted, all the information is there. The compensation, they get paid for being in the study.
Perfect.
$465.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you for allowing me to
all
talk.
information is good information. So definitely let's go ahead and get some last thoughts. I have enjoyed this immensely. I don't know about you guys. Eileen, would you like to go first?
I'll just say a quick thank you for including me. And none of this is possible without the community. And I'm just here to hopefully channel some of the energy and the ideas and to keep trying to move this forward one little bit at a time.
Thank you so much. We appreciate
on
you.
your vacation.
Absolutely. That's commitment, and I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Miss Waheeda, any last words?
Yeah, I just want to say I've learned a lot as well. So I come to not just come to give, but I also come to receive. And I feel that what I have received from this community is so valuable. And even as one of the presenters, I'm feeling a change. I'm learning some things, right? And thank you, everybody who made contributions. We're going to continue this conversation at USCHA. Hopefully we can get it live streamed. We're going to be on Friday, session 2 to 4, Friday, September the 8th. Dawn, you won't be there. You may be there, but Bridgette and I and Jeff Taylor will definitely be in that room waiting to receive you, and we're going to continue this conversation. The last thing I want to say is I'm really interested in that weight gain research. So if anybody can drop something in the chat for me for that, I'll be very thankful. And thank you all for joining us.
Absolutely. Dawn?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to echo everyone's thanks. Eileen, thanks for coming in from your vacation and kind of helping us think about things in a whole new way. We always say the information isn't out there, and it turns out the information is out there, but it's out there in tiny little scatter plots, and it's really helpful when somebody else weeds through those and brings them all together for us. So thank you very much for that. And thank you all for caring enough to spend some time today just having these conversations. I think that we have an enormous amount of power as the community, and we have to kind of leverage our voices and each other to kind of get the answers we want, that we need. So I look forward to working with all of you on that. And there's so much more to talk about cure research, but stay tuned. Little dribs and drabs is a great way to start.
Absolutely. And so for my part, I want to encourage everyone to continue on with the Cure series. The next one will be held on September the 19th, and it is called Diagnosed at Birth. This will be with our lifetime HIV survivors. So for those of you who may have joined late, lifetime survivors are those who have been diagnosed with HIV from birth or at a very early age. And so they've been living with HIV for their whole lifetime. And I think that will be an enlightening and illuminating conversation. For all of the men who joined on today, thank you for taking the time to be a part of the community and the process. How we got here is very different, but we are all living the same life and all still trying to thrive within the same, I don't call it a disease process, I call it a life process, within the same life process. So thank you for being here and being engaged in the conversation and taking part of the conversation. And so we encourage you to share. Each one teach one, each one reach one. So share what you've learned, share what you've heard, share the links, and continue to be a part of it. And so thank you so very, very much. Michael, do you have anything that you want to add?
I just want to add that you are a perfect hostess, and thank you for taking care of everything. I've had to do nothing except respond to people's chats. Bridgette, you rock.
Thank you.
Alright.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It is always my pleasure to give back to the community. It is how I continue to affirm my journey in this life. So any chance I get, I'm there.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Please have a blessed rest of your week. Stay cool if you're in a hot area, and drink lots of water. Nurse's orders.
Oh, there you go.
Got
Happy
it.
birthday, Waheeda.
Bye. Happy
Thank you so
birthday.
much, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you all. This was
Birthday.
marvelous.
Bye.